Imagine being born a king, but your family tree looks more like a family knot. Your parents are uncle and niece, your grandparents, also cousins, and your great-great-grandparents, the same people, twice over. That's not a royal pedigree, that's a genetic horror story. Meet Charles II of Spain, the man historians call the Bewitched, the most inbred leader in recorded history, a king so genetically tangled that scientists still use him as a case study in how not to run a dynasty. To understand how Charles II became the ultimate genetic experiment gone wrong, we have to look at his family, the Habsburgs. The Habsburg dynasty ruled half of Europe for centuries, Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, even the Americas. But they had one tiny problem. They were obsessed with keeping power in the family. And I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean literally they married each other. Over and over. By the 16th century, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs had developed a pattern. Uncle marries niece, cousin marries cousin. Sometimes they reused ancestors like Netflix reuses actors. For example, Charles II's father, Philip IV, married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. Yes, his niece. That's the equivalent of you marrying your sister's daughter. And if that's not wild enough, Charles's grandparents were also uncle and niece. So by the time Charles was born, his family tree didn't branch out, it looped back like a spaghetti knot. And before we continue, if you love these kinds of crazy, unbelievable history stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button as I've got plenty more royal disasters and ancient scandals coming your way. Now what happens when a family does this for 200 years? You get what geneticists call an inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how related your parents are. Most people today have a coefficient of around 0.0 because of unrelated parents. However, children of first cousins have around 0.0625 and children of uncle-niece unions around 0.125. And now here we have our Charles II of Spain with a whopping 0.25. Even though it's not a competition, he surely won. That's the same as being the child of a half-sibling or parent-child relationship. In other words, genetically speaking, Charles was his own cousin. Twice. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think royal inbreeding was a tragic mistake or just the price of power back then? Anyhow, Charles II was born in 1661, and from day one it was clear something was wrong. Who would have thought right? He was frail, sickly, and couldn't walk or talk until years later than normal. He had a misshapen skull, a weak chin that jutted out like a caricature, and could barely chew his food properly. This famous Habsburg jaw, that long, protruding chin, wasn't just a family trait. It was the physical signature of centuries of inbreeding. He suffered from seizures, intestinal problems, and infertility. His autopsy later revealed that his body was so deformed internally that doctors reportedly said his heart was the size of a peppercorn and his lungs corroded, and yet he was king. He ruled one of the most powerful empires on earth, Spain, the Americas, parts of Italy and the Netherlands, all under the rule of a man who by some accounts couldn't even chew properly. By the time Charles II took the throne, Spain was a shell of its former self. Once the richest empire on earth, flush with gold from the Americas, it was now drowning in debt, famine and corruption. And its king? A man who could barely rule himself, let alone an empire. Charles was only 4 years old when his father, Philip IV, died. From that moment, his mother, Mariana of Austria, became Queen Regent and basically ran the show. But Mariana wasn't ruling Spain. She was ruling for Spain, or more accurately for her son's survival. You see, Charles was constantly sick. He couldn't walk properly until he was 8. He drooled excessively, couldn't speak clearly, and his fragile health meant he was surrounded by priests, doctors, and superstitious advisors all day long. If the poor guy sneezed, half the palace went into panic mode. Mariana believed her son's illnesses weren't natural. She blamed witches, curses, and demons. And honestly, the people of Spain agreed. Rumours spread that Charles was el hechizado, the bewitched. Nobles whispered that his deformities and infertility were signs of dark magic. So, in true 17th century fashion, what did they do? They ordered exorcisms, yes. The King of Spain, one of the most powerful men on earth, was subjected to multiple exorcisms because people thought Satan had taken up residence in his jaw. Now here's where the story of Charles II crosses the line from tragic to straight-up supernatural. By the late 1690s, the king's health was in complete collapse. He couldn't eat without vomiting, he couldn't walk more than a few steps, and he suffered constant pain. His courtiers were desperate for answers, and when medicine fails, superstition always finds a way in. Rumours began spreading that Charles wasn't just sick, he was bewitched. Not metaphorically, literally bewitched by dark magic. One of his confessors, Father Froilan Diaz, a royal chaplain, became convinced that the king's condition was not natural. He claimed that witches had cursed Charles by feeding him enchanted chocolate during his youth. Yes, chocolate, because apparently even desserts were dangerous in 17th century Spain. Soon, an official investigation into witchcraft was launched. Think of it as an exorcism crossed with a CSI episode, if CSI was run by monks with incense. The priest began a series of exorcisms right in the royal palace. Witnesses described rooms filled with holy water, burning candles, and the constant murmuring of prayers. They would press crucifixes to the king's head and chant over him for hours, sometimes days. And then came the climax, the moment that went down in history. During one particularly intense ritual, Father Diaz declared that the spirits had revealed the cause of Charles's suffering. He announced that the devil's servants had placed objects inside the king's body, a nail, a bone, and pieces of human hair. To prove it, they claimed to have extracted those items from Charles's skull. Now no one really saw this happen. It was all reported second-hand through letters and church records, but the story spread like wildfire. The King of Spain had been physically infested with witchcraft. Commoners saw it as divine proof. The nobility saw it as political chaos. And Charles, he believed it. Completely. He was terrified, convinced that dark forces had been attacking him since childhood. He even ordered more exorcisms, believing that the first one hadn't gone far enough. But here's where it gets even wilder. Father Diaz, the man who led the exorcisms, soon fell out of favour. Other priests accused him of using demonic methods to cure the king. So in true Spanish Inquisition fashion, they arrested him for witchcraft. Yes, the priest who accused witches of cursing the king was himself accused of witchcraft. It's almost poetic. And of course none of this worked. Charles didn't get better, he got worse. His seizures intensified, his body failed him, and his faith only deepened his fear. What modern historians and doctors believe now is far less mystical, and far more tragic. Those nails and bones supposedly pulled from his skull were likely a combination of symptoms misinterpreted through superstition. His chronic infections, severe hydrocephalus, excess fluid in the brain, and misshapen skull may have caused strange discharges or swelling that frightened those around him. So to a 17th century eye, it looked like demons. To us it looks like genetics and poor medicine. But for Charles II, this wasn't folklore, it was reality. He lived in constant fear of being cursed, surrounded by people who reinforced that fear. And maybe that's the saddest part. He was a man caught between science and superstition, born centuries too soon to know the truth. The demons haunting Charles II weren't witches or ghosts. They were the ghosts of his own ancestry. Meanwhile, Spain's rivals, France, England, and the Netherlands, were circling like vultures. They saw the writing on the wall. The Spanish Habsburgs were dying out. Court factions formed. Some supported his mother, others wanted to replace her influence with new advisors. It was basically Game of Thrones, but everyone was related and half of them were coughing up blood. And through all this chaos, Charles remained childless. 2 marriages, one to Marie-Louise of Orleans, then to Maria Anna of Neuburg, and not a single heir. Doctors blamed witchcraft, bad omens, and divine punishment. Modern science blames something much simpler, inbreeding depression, where harmful genetic traits accumulate generation after generation. One modern study in Nature Communications calculated that Charles's health problems were mathematically predictable from his genealogy. His ancestors had passed down so many identical genes that his body was, in essence, self-sabotaging from birth. And as Charles weakened, so did the empire. By the 1690s, Spain's army was losing battles, its treasury was empty, and famine swept the countryside. The once mighty empire built on gold and glory was now held together by prayer and superstition, and at the centre of it all, a dying king who believed he was cursed. By the time Charles II reached his 30s, his condition had deteriorated dramatically. He suffered from epileptic fits, couldn't eat without assistance, and spent much of his reign bedridden. Foreign ambassadors visiting Madrid described him as a walking corpse. He was pale, bloated and frail, Yet even on his worst days, the Spanish court tried to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. But everyone knew the truth. The Habsburg dynasty was collapsing. Charles's greatest fear wasn't death. It was leaving Spain without an heir. He prayed constantly, fasted, and underwent religious rituals in hopes of divine intervention. At one point, priests even dug up the body of his great-grandmother to perform a ritual to break his supposed curse. It didn't work. Spoiler alert, it never works. In 1700, Charles fell gravely ill. His last days were filled with visions and religious hallucinations. He reportedly believed he was being haunted by demons. His court physician wrote that the king's body was so weak that he cannot eat, speak, or move. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II died. He was only 38 years old, the last of his line. When doctors performed an autopsy, the report was horrifying. He had no single healthy organ, and his head was filled with water. That's not just a tragic end. That's what happens when an entire royal family tree collapses inward. With Charles gone, Spain faced a massive crisis. Who would take the throne? His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, one of Europe's largest conflicts. France, Austria, and England all fought to claim the Spanish crown. The result? Tens of thousands dead, and the European political map forever changed. The last Spanish Habsburg, the man born from centuries of inbreeding, didn't just die. He took an empire down with him. The craziest thing is that the Habsburgs were so proud of their bloodline that they bragged about it in their family motto, "Let others wage wars, you, happy Austria, marry." Which basically means, why fight for land when you can just marry your cousin and inherit it? Modern geneticists actually recreated the Habsburg family tree and found 16 generations of intermarriage. That's like if your family only dated within your small high school. For 200 years. And the infamous Habsburg jaw was so exaggerated by Charles's time that artists painting him had to tone it down so he wouldn't look monstrous. Imagine your royal portrait being photoshopped. In the 1600s, even after his death, Charles II of Spain remained a figure people couldn't quite categorize. To some, he was a victim. To others, a curse made flesh. In Madrid, they called him El Hechizado, the bewitched king. But among the peasants who saw his face only on coins and portraits, there was pity. They whispered that he'd been born with too much crown and not enough childhood. He never led an army, never fathered a child, and rarely left the walls of his palace, and yet every misfortune that struck Spain, from famine to war, was somehow laid at his feet. But calling him bewitched wasn't just superstition. It was also a convenient excuse, a way to explain away centuries of poor decisions. Because blaming witches is easier than admitting that your dynasty spent 200 years ignoring biology. After his death in 1700, Charles's legacy became political ammunition. The Bourbons of France used his frailty as proof that the Habsburgs were unfit to rule. Pamphlets mocked his bewitched lineage. Some even printed exaggerated drawings of his infamous chin as warning signs against tainted blood. It was royal propaganda meets early genetic education, centuries before the term genetics even existed. His death sparked the War of the Spanish Succession. In a strange way, the most fragile man in Europe caused one of its strongest aftershocks. Back in Spain, stories about the innocent king grew almost saint-like. People claimed that his suffering was divine punishment for the sins of his ancestors. Others believed he'd absorbed Spain's curse so the nation could be reborn. Monks prayed for his soul, poets pitied his weakness, and ordinary Spaniards who'd lived through famine and war couldn't help but see something human in him. He wasn't a tyrant or a conqueror. He was a man who never stood a chance. But here's the twist. For all his frailty, Charles's story is still strangely powerful, because it's not just about biology, it's about hubris. The belief that kings and queens could outsmart nature, that titles and bloodlines mattered more than health or humanity. In the end, the Habsburgs' obsession with purity destroyed the very thing they were trying to protect, their dynasty. And yet, maybe that's why his story still fascinates us. It's tragic, it's grotesque, it's human. It's a reminder that even the mightiest empires can collapse, not with a bang, but with a whimper from a sickbed. Charles II wasn't evil or mad or cursed. He was the product of a royal experiment gone wrong, the living sum of generations who thought they could cheat the laws of nature. So what can people today really take away from the story of Charles II of Spain, the most inbred ruler in history? It's easy to laugh at how absurd it sounds today. Kings marrying their nieces, cousins doubling as in-laws, and a royal family tree that looks like a circle. But beneath the strangeness, there's something deeply human. The Habsburgs weren't monsters. They were people trapped by their own system. They believed that royal blood was sacred, that keeping it pure would keep their empire strong. But in their quest for power and perfection, they built their own undoing, generation by generation, marriage by marriage. And Charles II, poor, fragile Charles, was the final chapter of that story. He wasn't cursed by witches. He was cursed by history. By centuries of politics, pride, and fear, his reign ended with no heir, no dynasty, and no glory. Just a quiet reminder that even the most powerful families can't escape the laws of nature. Because at the end of the day, Charles II's story isn't just about a sick king. It's about how far humanity will go to control what it should never try to control, and what happens when arrogance meets biology. Thanks for watching, and remember, history doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it inbreeds.